Welcome to the Arizona Department of Education's video on the changes to the new World History Standards. In 2018, the Arizona State Board of Education adopted new history and social studies standards. While the history standards are the same for both World and U.S., there are significant changes to the course considerations you will need to keep in mind when creating a World History course and its corresponding scope and sequence. In this video, we will cover a quick overview of the standards, examine what has changed, examine what are supplementary or additional standards and how they are added to your scope and sequences. We will also examine the course considerations with a specific emphasis to the changes, and lastly, look at why the changes were made. For social studies, we will start with anchor standards. In this case, we have 21 social studies anchor standards in 5 different content areas. Anchor standards are the skills all students should master by the time they graduate high school. What this means is that by the time a student leaves high school, they should have mastery of all these standards over the 3 years of required social studies courses. For a world history course, it is recommended to include most or all of the disciplinary skills and processes anchor standards and some of the history anchor standards. For a robust course, you should include at least one example from each main content area anchor standard. In discussions or work groups with your district or other colleagues, you can determine what standards become the focus of each of the social studies courses you will create. Those then become the emphasis in the scope and sequences for each individual course. For a complete and robust world history course, you will include disciplinary skills and processes standards, history standards, world history course considerations, some civic standards, some economic standards, and some geography standards. Let's start with all the standards. So first, the new standards include disciplinary skills and processes anchor standards, and then their specific standards. When creating a world history course scope and sequence, the best practices would be to include most or all of the disciplinary skills and processes standards. These standards encourage critical thinking and reading of both primary and secondary sources. They also enrich a world history course through inquiry and argumentation. Students will develop the skills to think like historians using these standards. Again, you do not have to cover all of these standards in your world history course scope and sequence, but it is recommended. Now for the history, anchor, and grade level standards. Like the disciplinary skills and processes, these standards are not necessarily taught all in one course. With your district or colleagues, you can determine which of the history standards to focus on in a world history course, or which to focus on in a U.S. history course, or which to include in both courses. The standards are created with the flexibility to create a course scope and sequence chronologically, thematically, regionally, using case studies, or in any way your district deems necessary to meet the needs of your students. Let's say your district has decided that History Anchor Standard 2 will be included in both a World History course and a U.S. History course scope and sequence. As your district then creates a scope and sequence, they decide to teach world history in a case study format and to incorporate History Anchor Standard 2, you then create a unit on the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries in a scope and sequence. For this unit, you then add Civic Standards HSC 1.4, analyze the evolution of civic virtues, democratic principles, constitutional rights, and human rights, and HSC 2.3, evaluate the evolution of ideals and rights established in historical documents, legislation, executive actions, and court cases that both enrich our political revolutions unit and, say, a French Revolution case study. You can then add Economic Standards HSE 2.1, explaining how scarcity results in economic decisions and evaluate their impacts on individuals, institutions, and societies, and HSE 3.3, evaluating the role of government in regulating market prices. These will increase the students' overall understanding of the French Revolution and its economic impacts. Lastly, you can add Geography Standard HSG 3.5, evaluating the impact of social, political, and economic decisions that have caused conflict or promotion of cooperation throughout time works perfectly in our unit. This standard will round out the unit and your case study, making a richer, more detailed analysis of the French Revolution and your world history course. A couple of the criticisms of the old standards were the traditional POs and the amount of content to be covered. The POs became a long checklist of must-do items, and to that end, world history courses developed into informational dumping grounds with no real understanding of why events happened in history or how they were connected. That meant that educators were teaching world history courses that were a mile wide and an inch deep. Students were not making connections to current events, nor having the ability to relate events, demonstrate cause and effect, or show change in continuity through historical eras. To address both of these criticisms, the new standards have course considerations. The world history course considerations include themes, concepts, and topics that a robust world history course scope and sequence should have. The world history course considerations are as follows. Using inquiry in history, high school students explore a variety of peoples, events, and movements in world history with a focus on inquiry into the impact of social, geographic, political, and economic influences on historical events. A world history course should include the study of the peoples of Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. A balanced approach to the Eastern and Western hemispheres for a comprehensive study of world history topics, and it is recommended that the course begin with the 15th century to allow for a depth of content and connection to current issues and events. A world history course can be organized in a variety of ways, including thematic, chronological, regional, or through case studies. To give further guidance, we have included bullet points as considerations. These include world belief systems, interregional interactions, revolutions in thought, industrial revolution, political revolutions, the global rise of nation states, the world wars in the interim period, genocides, the Cold War, global imperialism, and contemporary issues. A robust history course should include the course consideration, themes, concepts, topics, and timelines. When using the course considerations to create your world history course, the key changes to note are an emphasis on the study of the peoples from all over the world, not just Europe. This addresses the concern that the old standards were too Eurocentric. The world is a connected place, and as such, our students need to know the world in which they live in to understand it. To achieve this goal, a world history course must be balanced between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. This is not a Western civilization course, but a world history course. This means that equal time be devoted to African and Asian histories, European and American histories. What this may mean is that making sure that students understand the Eastern Hemisphere's philosophies of history and culture, and then how they relate to the Western Hemisphere's philosophies in history and culture. This gives a greater understanding of the relationships today and the root of events like the Renaissance that lay outside of Europe. The last significant change to the course considerations is making a world history course that begins in the 15th century. While this does mean you may not be able to devote the time to a pet era or civilization that you had in the past, those still are influences for the modern era and modern civilizations. The shorter time period enables teachers to delve deeper into the content that establishes then a more rich understanding for your students. This in turn enables students to think critically and make broader, more meaningful connections to the world in which they live in. The new world history standards are an exciting time for teachers and districts. The standards recommend that the course begin with the 15th century to allow for a depth of content and connection to current issues and events across the entire globe. Remember, a world history course can be organized in a variety of ways, including thematically, chronologically, regionally, through case studies, or really whatever way best suits your district and your students' needs. Thank you for watching our video on the brief overview of the New World History Standards. For questions or concerns, please contact either Tammy Waller at tammy.waller@azed.gov or Linda Burrows at linda.burrows@azed.gov, or you can visit the Arizona Department of Education Social Studies Standards website at any time. Thank you.